Thank you. All right, welcome everyone. I'm glad to see you all here today. So this is a great opportunity. We're a smaller group. So what I'd love for us to do is in the chat box, please start by introducing yourself and just share a little bit about, I know we have your name there, but a little bit about what interests you about the broad area in terms of racism, anti-racism, racial equity in regards to public health, or wherever field you're working in. Like, what is your area of interest related to this very broad topic? The way in which we have designed the breakout rooms is that it's really an opportunity for you to speak. So I'll be doing very little talking, really encouraging you all to speak, share, ask questions. I do have a few prompts here for you, which we can use as a bit of a guide. So hopefully you can all see those. So as I mentioned, just starting with an intro in the chat box. So my question is, what brings you here? Like, what's your area of interest? Are you working in this area already? Are you just trying to develop your own knowledge and expertise? Are you trying to do this for other people? What brings you into today's conversation? Okay, so I'll just give everyone some time to jot that into the chat box. If you would like to open up your mic and share, I'll invite you to do so. So just a little bit about me. I work with the National Collaborative Center for Determinants of Health as a senior knowledge translation specialist. And over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years or so, we have been doing more focused work around racism as a determinant of health, and I've been really leading that work at the center in partnership with others on the team. So what you see in terms of the resources which we provided, as Pemma said, is for the webinars. A lot of the webinars were developed in, I think most of them feature me, usually in partnership with others in the field. So one of my reflections really is how things have changed. The order on your screen is not necessarily how these were developed. The very first webinar there, Race in the Social Determinants of Health and Health Equity, that was really, the title for that, Race in the Social Determinants, is because at that time what we were seeing was that a lot of folks who were doing work around health equity and social determinants of health were not necessarily paying attention to racism. And so this was, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, we need to put racism as part of our conversation on the social determinants of health, hence race in the social determinants of health. I've also observed quite very positive shifts over the last couple of years where I'm seeing more and more organizations, both educational institutions, public health organizations and agencies, and others in different community sectors really paying attention to racism and what it means for us as societies and organizations, which to me is a really positive shift. Great, so thank you. So folks are introducing themselves. So that is a little bit about me. So I think when I came in here, I was thinking about the kinds of questions I tend to get when I do presentations or workshops around racism. And so that could be a very good place for us to start. Like, if you've done this work before, like, what kinds of questions do you get, or what kinds of questions do you have about using this in your own work? Imagine yourself, you're in front of a room of people, or in the virtual world as we are today. So what is that nightmare question which you expect to have? And I'll just ask for a second here as I record this. Oh, actually, no, it's still being recorded. Okay. So what kinds of questions come up for you as you do this work?
I have a question, if I could start.
Christine, thank you.
Yes, Christine, yeah, and I'll give you where I'm located. I'm a planning evaluation coordinator in health promotion for NS Health and mental health and addictions. And but I also do some chair work in health equity. And I've been following these series of webinars, and they're fantastic. And one particular, I think what drew me in was Dr. Gaynor Watson-Creed did one. And I've always been, so frustrated with the lack of community-based, race-based data in Canada. And so I think she was talking about that. But I'd also done a large jurisdictional scan literature review during the time of COVID, right? So like how that was impacting, and of course, we saw this Black Lives Matter movement during the whole COVID crises, and I've just learned so much in the last half year. The engagement is amazing. But one question I would have is that by the very nature of the institute we work in, we're not representative. So a lot of people on our health equity team are look like me. They're older women, and a lot of the question we sort of get is, you know, how do we engage in the community in an equitable way? We don't overburden people on our own team and within our own institution. And what is the, you know, what is the way to approach people to people out in the community in a way that you you get a full representation from everybody, so you're not going to the same contact over and over again, and that kind of thing. That's a lot of the questions we kind of get on our team, is we want to broaden the representation, but we're not quite sure how to do that in a way that's realistic.
Great. Thank you for that question, Christine. I'm sure many folks on the line are having to deal with similar questions. So in terms of the webinars we have, I think the one, maybe there's two which deal with sort of organizational capacity more deeply. That's the last one on the list, which is disrupting the color-coded labor market. That webinar, what we really talk about there is what organizations need to do internally so that you're actually able to respond to racism as a determinant of health. So one is think about yourself as an employer, right? So what we know is that within we see this pretty significant inequities related to income and employment experiences for BIPOC folks, so for Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples within organizations, even in in relatively progressive organizations, even in organizations with this sort of social change mandate. And so in that webinar, we talk about really the importance of paying attention to everything the organization does. So thinking about your hiring process. So if organizations are not representative, both what I'd say substantively, so in terms of both substantively and numerically, so who's actually there physically, but also how the organization thinks and functions, right? So the rules which are being used to guide organizational priority. I think when we think about representation, we need to think about it in both ways. And in that webinar, we talk a little bit about that. I did that in partnership with Dr. Fareen Karachuwala, who is, at the time, was an associate medical officer of health in Kingston, one of the Ontario Public Health units, just now at York. And that really came from, in her work, trying to answer very similar questions to what you were talking about. So I'd say that is quite helpful. And there's a lot of literature and experience from other organizations, not necessarily in public health, but which talks about sort of creating inclusive organizations. I think that kind of work could also be supportive to you. In terms of not burdening communities, I know there's a lot of engagement happening. The folks I work with, colleagues, friends, have their inboxes to hear and trying to make their way through it. But I think the way to do that is for organizations to actually become more inclusive, pretty much less oppressive spaces, right? Because one of the other things which happens is, as organizations try to become more diverse, you need to become also a safe place for BIPOC people. I'm making this everyone's work and everyone's business. I often think that creating more inclusive organizations is really good for all of us, right? And you can think about, we've all been under such tremendous pressure over the last couple of months, responding to COVID, responding to anti-Black racism and other issues, and having organizations which are inclusive, which allow us to bring our whole selves, ends up being good for not just for BIPOC folks, but really for all of us. So.
Yeah, and we had an announcement on the radio yesterday that our premier did an apology for any racism in the justice system and the police force, and they've got a task force of 28, and he's retiring. He'll be replaced. So, but like it's kind of was considered significant, and so they're going to move forward. And so I think another thing too would be like how you link up with other people that are doing the work, and I know from our perspective, of course, it's mental health and that kind of thing, but like it's that connectivity of who's doing the work in the community as well. I think it's important.
Absolutely.
Know how to make those connections. So this is one of them, obviously, right? But the more we can get, from the outside, and the more we can collaborate, and it's a continuous conversation, I guess.
Great. Thanks for that, Christine.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that. I'll just invite others to share if you have any questions, comments, if you've been using this, would like to hear how you're using it. I see a comment in the chat box, which I'm going to take next, which is from Michelle. Thanks for sharing that, Michelle. Michelle would like to deepen her understanding of how racism contributes to poverty and food insecurity. I think that's a really great piece. What we've been trying to do over the last little while is, as we do work on various determinants of health, say food insecurity or poverty, we're trying to really bring that intersectional analysis to talk about how different communities are affected, or how different systems interplay with food insecurity. And food insecurity and racism specifically, there's a proof study which is run by Valerie Tarasak. She is a professor out of the University of Toronto. Their work doesn't look at racism specifically, but in a lot of the analysis which they've been doing, you're seeing that for racialized peoples, we see higher levels of food insecurity. I'll also say that there are a number of community organizations. A lot of them tend to be community-led, which is really, I think, really important. Back to Christine's comment about linking up with people in different sectors and in different communities, which starts to make those connections, and which talk about like responses which are really being driven by community. I'm thinking about this group, which is Toronto-based, but the name escapes me. I think it's Black Creek Farms, that may be the name, but I'll find it. And so they are really a hands-on, locally driven group looking at issues of food insecurity for the Black community in Toronto. So I think you have those kinds of examples. I'm looking here at some of the resources we have posted. I just mentioned intersectionality. So we did have a webinar which looked at intersectionality and was really trying to bring that idea, which you're raising, Michelle, that we need to look at racism as it intersects with other issues. If we're looking at issues related to poverty, it's the same thing goes. Like, how do you bring an analysis which looks at systems and issues in quite comprehensive and complex ways? And thank you. Yes, it's Black Creek Community Farm that has been confirmed. Thanks for that, Megan. Great. Any other questions? So has anyone on the line used any of these webinars in your work? And if you have, would you like to share with us how you're using it and what aspects of it you found useful?
Could I jump in here for just a second and ask you to point to more on intersectionality?
Absolutely. I'll just go here. So let's see if I highlight that. I just highlighted that. So that was a webinar we did, and this we did as a dialogue-based series. We did it in English and French with different presenters. So for those of you online who speak both, I would say if you watch both, you will likely get slightly different things because the presenters were different. And so this was really trying to introduce the idea of intersectionality into public health, which is what we try to do with a lot of our work. So for folks in other sectors, intersectionality may be a common thread, but again, in public health, it's not something which we often use. I'd say that for me, my desire to bring in intersectionality it came from a sort of my own, anyway, I was actually getting a little bit fed up with hearing things like, if we deal with poverty, right, we're taking care of all the inequities which exist, and those kinds of sentiments, which I hear those less and less now, but about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, that was a fairly common thing I would hear in health equity conversations with public health folks. So it made us really realize that we needed to introduce this idea of intersectionality and say it's not an either or proposition. We really need to be thinking about, yes, I'm focusing on, say, early childhood development, but how are, say, how is immigration implicated in that? How is things around income implicated in that? So what are the differential experiences for people from different communities? Because when we take an intersectional lens to our work, it points us to different kinds of solutions. It points us to solutions which can be tailored for different groups. It points us to different systems of potential intervention. It points us to different kinds of partnerships. So I think about intersectionality as a theory, a practice, an analytical tool, but also something which is highly practical. For people interested in intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, who is credited for coining the term intersectionality, she runs an organization in the US called the African American Policy Center or Institute. throughout COVID, she has been doing what she called Under the Black Light, which is a series on intersectionality. It's called Under the Black Light, and the conversations are recorded. But I think the series she's been doing is a really good demonstration of how you can address multiple issues and come into the conversation from multiple perspectives and pretty much interrogating different kinds of systems.
Thank you very much. That was helpful.
You're welcome. I'll also mention that in terms of intersectionality, we have a short document which I will try and pull up, which is called Public Health Speaks, Intersectionality and Health Equity. It's on our website in English and French. And it's a dialogue-based document with, I believe, 3 or 4 folks just talking about how they understand intersectionality and how they try and use it as an approach in their work. Cool. Thank you. Any more questions and comments? So we have about 5 more minutes. So we still have some time to address some particular questions. So I'll leave people space there to drop a comment in the chat box or to open up your line if you'd like to speak. So while you're doing that, one of the things which came to mind for me was just, I think for folks who, like for our own learning, if you think about this for your own learning, there's obviously lots of resources. The work we've done at NCCDH, I think we're just barely scratching the surface of what you could be covering around this. So I think there are lots of organizations who you can go to for this. In the Canadian health system context, unfortunately, we don't have as much, but I'm seeing more and more of those things show up. There's a lot of resources coming up from the US, which I think is very, very relevant to the work we do. A lot of the work around critical race theory, a lot of it is American-based authors, is authors in Canada, Australia, and other places. So to me, there's always a lot of applicability for that work. The other thing I'll mention is, if you're going to be facilitating these conversations with your teams, with students, in communities, it's really important to spend some time developing your own sort of skill and comfort level to hold space for conversations around race and racism. In my experience, and I've been doing sort of social justice education in different forms for over 15 years, and there's something about racism I found. There's something about talking about race, racism, whiteness, white supremacy, which seems to get our guts in a very profound way. And I think it's important for us to hold space for those conversations, for us to be prepared to allow open conversation while pushing. I think we need to push ourselves to really think about what this means in our lives as individuals, as organizations, and as a society. And that often takes us to places which are deeply emotional. And I think it's Bell Hooks who talks about the importance of us having spaces which are safe to struggle, right? So spaces where we can actually come in and grapple with these issues in very real and authentic ways, and so not shine away from those. What I also know happens a lot is, particularly in early days in organizations and communities, is those first conversations can be very tense. It sometimes feels like, things are coming apart instead of coming together. And I think that is okay, because we have to go through some of those motions, and every organization will be different. For us as individuals, that will also be different. But what I've also found is that in doing so, if we can do it well, if we can hold space, if we can go to those places of profound joy and even profound pain, then when we come out on the other side, we're often better for it, right? Because we're at that point where we're open and we can imagine something different. The last thing I will say, and I'm going to wait for more questions and comments to come in here, is that this is reflective work, but it's also action-oriented work. I think a lot of the times when organizations start to invest in anti-racist work and practice, there's a lot of time spent in training and education, which is important, so we actually know what we're talking about, but that cannot be the work, right? The work is ultimately transforming our society and transforming the communities we live in and the organizations we live in. So I often think, how do we know we're doing good work? How do we know we're successful? To me, it's when racialized folks, indigenous folks are in spaces which are not oppressive, which are free from that kind of discrimination, where we're seeing the equitable outcomes which we know are actually very possible very, and very necessary. And it needs time. Well, it takes time, sometimes not, sometimes it can be faster. We're seeing that with COVID, we can do things really quickly when we really want to. But it takes investment. It takes investment of resources, and takes investment of people, time, and we need to provide that. It's not something which we can do as just yet another thing off the side of our desk. I think if we want to do this work, we have to really commit ourselves to it fully. And there's tons out there. There's tons we can be learning from other folks. So I usually have like random books all over me. So this is like one of my favorites, which is Bell Hook's Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope. Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde is another favorite, which I go to that on the days when I just think, oh gosh, I've had it, you know, because you're challenged and you're also inspired at the same time. So I think we can just draw from so much out there in terms of writers, in terms of things which are, you know, if you're a theory junkie, this is something for you. If you want something which is highly practical, there are lots of guidance documents which you can draw from. And I'd say they don't have to be health specific. They don't have to be public health specific, because it's always something I think we can learn from other sectors. From what other sectors are doing. Okay, so we have a question coming in. So the question is how to identify and speak out against tokenism as a BIPOC person. So how do you understand this and prevent it as you continue to work on anti-racist work? I think that's a really great question. Thanks for sending that. I think that is something which comes up very frequently. And Christine, when you spoke, I think you started to hint at that a little bit. In your question, I think you actually have your answer. The first is being able to name it. There's something so powerful about saying, here's what I am seeing happening, right? Here's what I am seeing happening. And we don't name things nearly enough. And I think as a racialized person, Black, Indigenous, person of color, it can feel, it's a hard thing to do, right? Because there's a huge risk which comes with that. I have been there myself, and in those moments, I have to find it deep in me to trust that I'm going to say that it's going to be received well or okay-ish, right? But it requires that you come from a place of courage and trust, and that's the only way. And coming from a place of trust and courage is a hard thing to do when you have experienced racism, when you know that, yes, in the past I tried this and I got shut down, no one listened to me. But I think it's really important, and because I have this in front of me, I'm going to read from it. This was Paulo Freire who said, it is imperative that we maintain hope, even when the harshness of reality may suggest the opposite. So I think, again, saying, I'm going to trust that in this situation, I can raise this. And yes, I may be penalized for it, but I'm going to still trust it. And being able to just continue the conversation. It may require more than one conversation. I have also found that finding communities of support, so other people within the organization or externally who can provide some guidance, some mentorship, some coaching, or even just an ear to say, "Ooh, I'm having a really hard day, and this is what's going on." Because oftentimes in those conversations, you may get some really specific things for the particular situation you're dealing with. But I'll say, don't go at this alone. So thank you all so much. If you have any more questions, I'm going to drop my email, or you can find it on the website. I'm going to drop my email in here, and please feel free to email me. Happy to chat about this more. Thank you all.